8:01. So over to you to kind of start things off, and looking forward to this conversation.
As always, let's just get my screen sorted. There we go. We should be there. Little sneak peek at what's coming. We will obviously talk about that later as well. But before we get rolling this morning, excuse me, as always, and as with importance to us and to SAIT as well, we like to take a moment just to stop and recognize and acknowledge that Calgary and SAIT's campus, main campus, is based in Calgary, is situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So today that encompasses the Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region. That is the Siksika, the Kainai, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT also acknowledges all of the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. We're not all based in Treaty 7. In fact, I think I saw a note in the chat there with somebody saying that Treaty 6 was the Edmonton area. Yeah. Wherever you are this morning, all the way across Canada, thank you just for taking a moment to recognize the land that you're connected to. For all of us, it's a traditional land. It's a place where we walk in the footprints of our Métis people.
Perfect.
Well, drop this. There you go.
There you go. Thank you. So just to keep in mind, folks, is if you haven't joined us before, I'll be watching the chat and the questions over here. I've got a few questions written down for Jenny this morning. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm checking on. But today we wanted to talk about the culture of high performing teams. And I think hopefully everybody on this line has been part of what you would call a great team. I'd be curious just to get some thoughts going in the chat of, if you've been on a great team, what makes it or what made it a great team? Hopefully you're on a great team right now. I know I am, but what makes a great team or what made it? So we've seen some comments come in there already. Jenny, thoughts to you as folks start to put their comments in here. What makes a great team?
I think what we're going to see, and I'm sort of looking left because the chat's up in my top left-hand corner, we're going to see an awful lot of words, and they are already about people. It comes down to the people. And, they're quite worn out these days, but people don't leave companies, people leave people. Companies don't have great ideas, people have great ideas. And so where we flourish is where we find our people. And that doesn't mean, for the longest time, we thought our people meant we had to be the same, we had to think alike, we had to, have that perfect chemistry, not necessarily. And I've lost the chat is just flowing now, but yeah, there's an awful lot of trust and respect and those kind of pieces in there. I think that's the foundation, absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm just kind of taking a look back: mutual respect, trust, open communication, trust. It's all over there. Yeah. Trust and honesty, authenticity. Now I quite like that one. I think we might be able to double click on that one a little bit. Collaboration, transparency, good humor as well. Some days my team thinks I have that. There's other days they think it's probably not that good. So that's fantastic. Sense of belonging. A supervisor who does not micromanage and makes everyone accountable. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a in fact, let's find it. We have a slide for that because there's been a ton of work done in this area. And one of the sort of key, the most recent one, Kevin Oakes, and there's a book and we're just going to flick here, a book and a website and everything, but I4CP is his company. The book is called Cultural Renovation. I love that terminology because when we renovate something, we're kind of tidying it. We're just changing a little bit. It doesn't mean a full clean sweep out. So it makes it easier to start with. But they found through a whole series of research that there were 6 elements that form a healthy culture. Now, this is organizational. So I think our conversation will drop down to teams a bit more than organizational. But notice there, sort of 4th dot across from the left, values, execution, and accountability. And a lot of times when we're talking about culture, people want to dismiss it until it's that fluffy stuff, or, I don't have time for all of that piece. But we can talk about execution and accountability. And at the end of the day, that's what this is about. It's hitting that top performance piece. It's not about having a party or a snooker table or a funky coffee room when we're back at the office. It really is about hitting those high performance pieces. And how do we get the best from our teams? And in order to do that, we have to look at them as people, not machines. Stop there.
Absolutely. I love the fifth one there too. Fifth from the left, obsessed with delivering value. I like the language in that one because, lots of companies talk it, but I really like the way that's worded. Sorry. That caught my eye. On the flip side, I think some of us perhaps have at times been part of a team from hell, or not as productive a team. Sorry for the salty language first thing, but what have you noticed in that instance when you've been on a team that perhaps is not performing as highly? What are the issues? What are the challenges? What's going on with the people on those teams? And so, for me, I think I've seen instances where you have the lone wolf, backstabbing, obviously. There we go. There's the opposites of everything we talked about before. Everyone does everything for themselves. That is an interesting comment, right? Is how do you get everybody on a team who may have very different individual goals, right? Team objectives are hopefully the same, but when you have folks going their own way, the lone wolf who may get you really good short-term results, but is leaving a wake as they go past. So interesting. Lack of caring by leadership. Really interesting comment, Brad. I appreciate that.
It's interesting too. Care is a big piece of trust, isn't it? Remember, we were talking the other week. I think we had those 4 pieces of trust, and care is one of them. So that sort of knocks on that trust piece.
Where high performers become discouraged, lack of transparency, a leader that dictates. Yeah. So, it may have been an obvious question, folks, but I think it's really important to highlight. We know it when we see it, right? So I guess, Jenny, this brings a couple questions to mind for me. Is if this is truly about building culture, let's leave the performance part out of this for a second.
Sure. Yeah.
How do you have a culture conversation? And how many folks, I'd be really curious to know, just by way of comment, how many folks have intentionally had a culture conversation with their teams, or have been part of their leader having a culture conversation? So Jenny, thoughts on how do you do that as a leader?
It's a good question, especially with the timing, because with the pandemic and everybody forced to go home, and the length of time that we've been out of the office, some places still are, the culture that we had before has changed. So we need to be having culture conversations. I think in the end, it comes down to, culture is quite simple. It's our behaviors. It's what we do. It's what we reward. It's what we punish, and it's what we tolerate. And so a great place to start the culture conversation is there a gap between what we're saying or what's on our wall and what we're doing? And what does that gap look like? And then, it depends on you and your team, and it really does depend on the level of psychological safety. We're always going to come back to this. But if you start a culture conversation and nobody talks, or they're giving you the benign answers, then that's a flag in itself. That's a really big, okay, we have something going on here. We're going to have to work to get a little bit deeper. But if we say what gets punished here, what's career limiting suicide here, or career limiting move, that's it, isn't it, or career suicide? What are the pieces that we're tolerating that perhaps as a team we don't want to tolerate? If you don't want to dive in that deep, start with what do we like, what do we not like, what do we want to keep, what do we want to get rid of? I was chatting with one of our daughters. They're in the middle of tryouts for a high school team now. And I said, do you guys talk about what that looks like once your team is set? She said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's going to be minus 35 in January. You turn up for an early morning practice. Who's going to feel like that? None of these kids want to get up at 6 o'clock, and they all do. And so how do you switch that on so you make that practice worthwhile? I have to be honest, she did roll her eyes at me, but can transfer it to our workplace. What do we do when crisis hits again? What do we do when change hits again? How are we going to take that on? And all of that's culture conversation. It's talking about what we do on a daily basis.
Interesting. So, thought in any particular tips? I like that conversation around, what do we like, what do we don't like. Any other exercises? Sorry, I know this one I'm springing on you, but any other exercises or things, tools, tips that you would use to, if you want to be intentional and sit down and have a conversation with your team on Monday morning. Hey, just attended this conversation on Friday. I think it's important for us to talk about it. Maybe you wouldn't necessarily spring it on them for Monday, but how would you lead that conversation? How would you advise leaders to take their teams through that?
Okay, you did spring that one on me. Friday morning. It's going to depend on the team. Like, everybody out there knows their team the best.
Yeah.
So that's going to depend on the personality pieces. I'm noticing in the chat, people are talking about one-on-ones and team pieces. I like this idea of a team conversation. And I think actually I would start with, like, who are we and why do we matter?
Okay.
What's our purpose? And why are we here, and why do we matter? And just from there, as ideas start to flow, and they're slow when they first come, and maybe, if you're working from home, maybe you have an online collaboration place where you can just collect things over the week. Just pose the question and say, as we move through the week, what does this look like? And it's interesting because, and here we go, it depends on the humor on your team. Like, so, well, I answer emails all day. Fantastic. Okay. And come back to what I4CP had on there. Obsessed with delivering, what was the words? Obsessed to delivering the value to external customers. I think that was the one that you picked out.
Yeah.
That's why we matter. Actually, it's quite a cool one for the world that we work in, because every day, that's what we're obsessed with, is how do we show up for whoever's in my audience, whoever is your client, to help or to serve or to make it better for them. And so if you track that over a week with your team and have them pay attention to it, and I would open the door, pay attention to what you like about who we are and why we matter, and pay attention to what doesn't sit so well with you. And there's no right or wrong, that just is. But that gives us a really good place to start from. And then we can look at, what do we want to lose? What do we want to keep? And that starts to drive that conversation.
Yeah, I like that. And you touched on something there too that I think is important, especially in the environment that we're in right now, is, is there something that we need to consider differently about doing this in a remote or hybrid environment than if you were a team that was going into the office every week, being able to sit around the meeting table every week? Like, is there, obviously it's an obvious question, sorry, there is nuance to it, right? This is different. I think, at least I know for me, even, the team Zoom meetings are starting to wear a little bit thin at times, right? So in this remote environment, any thoughts?
I'm laughing because I knew you were going to ask me that question. It's the only one I have things written down for, and I don't have it on a slide, but we can move it across to people like what we're talking about. So I think it is the same, and it's not the same. So that's the first thing to remember. We don't want to lose anything that's good that we were doing already. When it comes to remote teams, the piece I want to just touch on, because I think this is so important, is onboarding. In the past piece, we've welcomed people into our teams who we've never met face to face. And nowadays, maybe we can, but there was a point there where we couldn't, and maybe we're set up so that we won't, or we don't have to. So what does that initial onboarding piece look like? And I'm really sorry, I can't remember who this comes from, but I read somewhere, what do you want your people to know, do, feel, and think? And by when? So after their first day, I need my new team member to know, feel, think, and do. Like, what does that look like? And that can be a team conversation as you welcome somebody, prior to when you welcome someone in. And then after a week, and then after 2 weeks, what would we like them to know, do, feel, and think? And if you think about it, when we work face to face, when we arrived at a new company, it's like going to a brand new school or something. It's just awful because you arrive and you don't have your technology and you don't know who's who. You don't even know where the washroom is. And so starting those conversations early, I think it's always important, but I think when it's remote, it's even more important. And some companies have that buddy system or that mentor system, or here's a person that you can, okay, I volunteer. When Joe joins our company, they can ask me anything and I will help them. I'll set that aside for a week, or maybe we share that responsibility over the first month, whatever that might look like. Yeah. The other piece when we're working remote, and it's a curious one when we're talking about culture, but it's actually bringing it back to work, is prioritizing what meaningful work is. And we can't just think that piece. We have to talk about it, because if you as my leader aren't talking about it continuously, there's the second bit, cadence of communication always changes when we're remote. But if you're not talking about it, I'm not thinking about it. And so I have to hear that more times, because when we're separated, it's easier to fall out of sync. And especially if you've got somebody, I would be a prime example. I love this. I'm going to work on this for hours. Jenny, that's not the most important thing. We need to bring it back over here. Okay, yes, that's fun, but come back over here and do the important work.
Yeah, and I think there's a piece of this environment that we're in now, and I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday. It becomes that much more difficult to be intentional about carving out time to do specific work. And I say that simply because it is so simple now to go from one meeting at 10:59 to another meeting at 11:00. Everything is so rigidly scheduled now, it feels like to me. If you're not intentional about carving out that time, and this isn't a conversation that you can just have off the cuff, right? No. You do need to be intentional about this. Yes, there's pieces that you can do when you're chatting with team members to check in, see how they're doing, see how they're feeling, and important stuff that you need to be focused on. But if you're not, if you truly want to try to improve your culture, you have to set time for it. And it feels to me, at least maybe this is a person, I'd be curious to know how others feel, but it just feels to me like over the past 18, 19, 20 months, time for thinking and some of this other work, it becomes that much more difficult to carve into the day, because you are so scheduled with every conversation you have to have now.
I think you just nailed it. Actually, it's the intentional, and that's why culture is difficult, because it has to be intentional. And it's a really good point. Like, how do you carve that time out? How do you protect that thinking time? How do you keep that chemistry piece in terms of the communication going? And I think that we get hooked up on, it became really prominent. People kept talking about, we're missing the water cooler conversations. Well, I've never had a conversation with you near a water cooler. Like, let's be honest. I don't even know where the water cooler is. But the piece in there too is, are we keeping that cadence of communication? And it doesn't just have to be this. And so it is as simple as, when we're not having that thinking time. And I think that's important too. You have to block that out of your calendar. And I'll put my hand, I'm dreadful for not doing that. I don't do it enough. And so you have to put that in there and be religious to that piece, and you control that. So there's a conversation there too that you can help your people with. But on the other side, when we're not in that thinking time, is keeping that cadence of communication. And it doesn't mean that you have to have 15, 30, 45 minutes scheduled to do this. This is good. We need this from time to time. But it is as simple as that little comment in Teams. Actually, sometimes it's as simple as, I recognize you sent me a message and you've got a thumbs up. Maybe it's a text, maybe it's a different piece. And so we have that network of communication going. And that's where we start to build some of this social capital. And that's the other thing that comes up as much in remote teams as it does in face-to-face teams, is that social capital is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
And that's the piece that connects us to, we were talking about those lone wolves beforehand. If we let them be that, they will be. And so, culture, the best definition I've ever seen, and that it is on the slides that we'll send to people, is culture is the worst behavior that you're currently tolerating.
I like that.
It's to stop and think about that too, actually, because if you ignore it, turn a blind eye, hope it'll go away under the carpet, you just made it a thing that we can do. You get what you tolerate, quite frankly.
100%. I'm just going to come back to a couple comments here, and then there is a question that's been posed. So Tavin, I love this. When a team has chemistry, culture can naturally be created when working in the same space. But you're 100% correct that more effort needs to be put in working remotely. Yeah, you really do. You have to be intentional about it. And, we've probably, like, I know for us, we have had team members who have onboarded and also left in the same time during this being remote, right? They've probably only met once or twice face to face. So it's really interesting. So interesting question here. I'm gonna hope it's not from my team. But what do you do when the person who is holding back the team is the leader?
Ew. Yeah, you do hope that's not from your team, don't you?
Yeah.
There is an ability to be anonymous in this question asking too. Okay, actually, you know what? This isn't a weird question. This comes up a lot. And so I always come back to it. It's going to depend on the people. We have this thing called empathizing upwards. And then there's also that piece managing upwards. And so it's going to depend on the leader. The piece that we often forget when we're on a team is that, we feel the pressure of deadlines, the pressure of what needs to get done, all those pieces. And that pressure to us, if I'm on your team, it feels to me like that's coming from the leader. And what we forget that is our leader has pressures coming down on them as well. And so empathizing upwards sometimes is an opportunity for a conversation. What's going on for them? What are they not seeing that we all see? And I was going to say if the psychological safety is high, but if the leader's holding you back, it's unlikely that your psychological safety is in a good place with that leader. It's hard to know without sight and situation. But if there's a crack to open the conversation, I would open the conversation. And how do we do that respectfully? We talk about team. We stay away from blame, shame, and judgment always, and open up ownership, accountability, and responsibility.
Yeah. Well, because
it's a difficult one to answer.
I like the thought about focusing. If you're going to be that individual who's feeling this, odds are there's others on the team that are feeling the same thing.
Yes.
And if they're not, then maybe that becomes a question of personal fit between you and that leader, right? If the rest of the team looks at you and says, no, things are great, you need to figure it out. That says something. But if everybody else on the team says, yeah, I think you're right, how do you then as a team start to take accountability and responsibility for having that conversation about what you as a team want to do? Because the leader should then be, in that case, following, right? They should be picking up, and at least that's my thought, right?
So, and I think Brad's got here in the chat, don't forget the leaders are people too.
Exactly.
So that's the first conversation. That's why I like this term, empathize upwards. I mean, what's going on? We would do that if it was a peer or a colleague. Everything okay? Yeah. I'm noticing X, Y, and Z. How can I help? What do we need? And that might be the start of the conversation.
Yeah, no, and it's a great point, because and I shared this with my team, I think earlier this week. Years ago, I had somebody say, Craig, your job as a leader is to make the choice between being a shock absorber and an amplifier. And that goes in both directions, right? So if things are coming down from the top, you have to decide what you're sheltering your team from and what you're highlighting for your team. So couple other things that came to mind here for me. So I want to kind of going on this leader piece, thoughts on the role of the leader in terms of creating that culture. When you look at whether they're pushing their team or pulling their team along. In other words, this whole concept of, a leader trying to inspire versus driving a team, if that makes sense.
It does. The first piece in there, I think, is that culture is definitely in leadership's responsibility and accountability.
Yeah.
And the book I mentioned beforehand, Kevin Oakes, it's got to start at the top. Now, I'd play with that one a little bit. I think it just takes one leader, and the ripple effect of that is huge. So yes, it's very, very difficult if your C-suite isn't practicing what they're preaching. Absolutely. But with you and your team, leader is important. Yes, in fact, essential. Driving and pulling. This is a really interesting one because we've talked about this before. When you talk about discretionary effort, when you talk about people,
yeah,
companies want to say, Craig, your job is to motivate and to inspire and to pull your people, and really, like, no, that's an almost impossible task. I think your job is to know your people. Because when you know your people, you know what makes them tick, you know how they work. And your job also is to create the conditions, create the environment that allows me to show up and do what I do best. And when we start to talk about creating that environment, we're talking about, are you creating the challenge? Are you giving me choice? Do I understand the purpose? I mean, we talked about this people were talking about this way back in the chat, that alignment piece. Do I get the big picture? And the list goes on. There's about 6 conditions that we can use to set up this environment. So as a leader, I don't think it's about sort of trying to have that speed. We've glorified leadership for so long as about the talk that drives everybody in. Well, not really. It's about real everyday people being able to show up and do the job that they passionately want to do. And sometimes do we need to help in that motivation piece? Yes, but when we want to motivate in that motivation piece, we're tapping into those essentials of intrinsic motivation: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Do I give them enough leash that they want? And we're all different. Here's the piece: know your people. So some people, Jenny, just get on with this. I'm here if you need me. Whereas another Jenny might be, Craig, I want to check in with you every week. Do we have time for that? I just need validation that I'm on the right road. 5 minutes, just check in. Can you just look at this piece? And so when you know your people, I think the next bit comes, and flipping back to where I started on here, discretionary effort is up to me.
Yep.
And I will base that on how I feel. And so your job as a leader is really easy. If you feel valued and whatever, then your job is to help me feel valued and supported. And I will perform daily and some of my best work.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. This concept of the inspirational leader, right? We've held that up for so long. And yes, as a leader, you do need to be able, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around communication and the cadence of communication. You do need to be able to communicate vision and direction and goals. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to be the world's greatest orator and being able to express that, but you do have to be able to tell your team, this is where we're heading, and this is why we want to head this way, and this is how we think we're going to get there. But as a part of that team, you got to make the choice to come along on that ride.
And I play with that bit too. Like, this is where I think this is the possibility that we have to walk into. Okay, this is where we can go. This is the day job. This is where we're expected to get to. This is where we can go. I believe we can get here. And there's a key piece there. You have to believe. If you don't believe it as a leader, you're not going to make it there.
Oh, your team will tell that pretty quick.
But in that question there is not so much here's how we're going to get there. There's a number of professionals on this team that get it. How do you think we can get there? pull them in, like have that ownership. And that, to me, that's where that culture probably starts. For the longest time, culture was, okay, and companies spent thousands on this. We need values, and we need this, and we need that. To what extent? Like, if you have the same value as every other company out there, what makes you different? Whereas where are we going to get to, and how are we going to do that? And what does that look like? And back to what we were saying at the beginning, what are the behaviors that will get us there? And you don't have to use that kind of language, but we want to be a world-class provider. Well, your first conversation has to be, what does world-class look like?
Yeah.
And carries on from there.
Yeah, and it touches on something else too that you just made me think of, is not to get too in the weeds on goal setting, but where does the role of stretch goals play in here? And I share this from the perspective that we're talking about, how do you create a culture for high performing teams, teams that exceed the bar, teams that just want to meet the expectation, just set goals that are achievable. Right? If you want to really truly be an extraordinary performing team, you're probably aiming for something further. So is there a role in this conversation around vision and where we want to be, and here's a stretch goal that we're aiming for? I'm just curious on that, because we're coming into the time of the year where a lot of organizations are now starting to think about their goals for next year.
I think so, and I think I promised I'd stay away from performance, but with those stretch goals, what we know is that challenge is a condition for performance. We like it, and we will buy into and work towards a stretch goal. But the key, and there's research galore behind this, the key is support. So if we have a stretch goal and no support from our leader, please don't have high expectations. But if we have a stretch goal and we have that full support and that understanding, then you're likely to kick that one out of the park. And we'll buy in, because we like a good challenge. Ask anybody what their best accomplishment is, or their favorite, accomplishment that makes them proud. They're going to tell you stories that they worked, it was sweat, blood, and tears to get there. Well, hopefully not, but the equivalent of that. And we're proud. We feel the change in that when we're talking about it. And it drives me bonkers when we have this, we're at that time of year. What are your goals for the next year? Well, I'm going to set them really easy, because then I'll make them, then I'll look good, and then we're sailing along quite nicely.
Yep. Actually speaks to a comment Ron just put in there, is that everyone wants their performance bonus at the end of the year. So
okay, I promise no soapboxes today.
I'm interpreting that as, don't set the goal too high, right, Ron? So, sorry, I interrupted you.
And it's a real life piece. Like, I have been into a corporate classroom, and I always say, why are you here today? Let's make this relevant. Why are you here today? Those of you who've hung out with me know I say that every time I get together with the group. And this one particular organization, hands down, every time someone will say, because if I'm here today, I get my bonus. You're welcome.
There you go.
Come on. And that's the other thing with stretch goals too, Craig. Does a stretch goal fit? Probably not. Like, we're so caught on that. You have to do this within 12 months.
Yeah.
I think, along with that, rethinking remote work, we need to relook at that. Like, why?
And I think, not to go too far down this performance rabbit hole, but yes, I think that's starting to change in some organizations. Where the annual review is gone, but a future conversation. There's a question here I want to share. A team member asked our leader if everything was okay, as she is lashing out at everyone. Her response is that she is frustrated with the team, and the verbal attacks have continued, as even asking her what is wrong did not make her stop to think about how she is treating people. How does the team now respond?
Oh, okay.
That's a deep one.
It is. We have to stay high level here, because we don't know any situations. Two things to think about. I think number one is this a long-term piece? And I'm going back pre-pandemic at this point, because what we know from the pandemic, we have this thing called surge capacity. And when the pandemic started, we were all on that surge capacity. It was a fight. You listen to the language, we were talking about fighting this, hanging out. And we ran out of steam for that really quickly, but we've stayed in that high function mode. And so our threat levels, we basically all have 3 different threat levels. And pre-pandemic, most of us started the day at 1. It takes a lot to wind someone like me up. So I might hit a threat level 2 in terms of how reactionary I would be, maybe once a week if somebody pressed exactly the right combination of buttons. And rarely would you see me in a 3. Now, everybody's different, but what they've shown in the neuro center down in the States is everybody starting their day on level 2. So we're starting at a much higher threat level. So our patience is thinner, our frustration is right there, our ability to lash out really quickly is just, it's much, much quicker because we're starting at such a higher point. Now that this has happened and this is leading, the other thing that the team could do, people don't get angry for no reason. People don't get frustrated for no reason. So is there value in flipping that back again and saying, okay, what's our part in this? Mm. Yeah, and you and I were laughing a few weeks ago now, but we talked about that. How fascinating. And the minute you do how fascinating, like what's my part in this? This isn't all on one person. This is a 2-way communication. And so can we begin to sift through? So come away again, blame, shame, and judgment on one side, ownership, accountability, and responsibility on the other side. Might give us a nugget or a starting point for the next conversation.
Yeah, in high level, I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. Obviously, not knowing what the specific details are, but I do like, and I think sometimes too, you may also just come to the realization there might not be anything that you can do in the moment. You may need to try and just ride it out and see, because who knows, everybody has a story that nobody else knows or understands at the moment. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I want to come back. We touched on authenticity earlier. Right? That was a comment that was in what makes a great team. And I think there was a couple comments in there about being authentic. And I read a Harvard article the other day, and it was talking about authenticity being a really important part of a great team. But authenticity not necessarily always meaning positivity, right? So you can be authentic, but authentic in sharing the positive, authentic in sharing the negative as well. Like great teams have the ability to sit together and say, this was fantastic, love how this went, this over here sucked, or this is really right. And I don't know if there's that triggers anything for you, but when authenticity came up in the chat, I thought this is interesting, right? Because it's not always Pollyanna and rose-colored glasses where great teams just focus on everything's wonderful, right?
I would suggest that if everything is nice, wonderful, that you don't have a high performing or a great team. Like really, when it gets down to the nitty gritty, how do you do that piece? Yeah. So with that authenticity, the way I hear that is, are we being real and are we being honest? And the thing that I connected with actually in the back of my head, there's SEALs, the Navy SEALs do this a lot, and they call them after action reviews. And Pixar hold a brain trust too, another brilliant tool that was put in there. And the purpose of both of those is to really get into, what did we do? Like, what did we set out to do? What did we end up with? What's the difference? And how did that come about? And with some proper boundaries, terms of engagement, if you like, those conversations are, well, they're not fun. Maybe they are, it depends on who you are, but they're real. And as you said, that we got this right. We did really well here, but I'm not sure that this was good. And here's what I think. And then you've got all those differing perspectives around that piece. And when we bring that out loud, we're coming back to what we were saying before. We start to recognize, what are we doing as a team? What's working? What will make it better? The key is it can't be personal.
100% right.
And
Yeah.
so there's your role as a leader when you're facilitating this, because we're at that hippo piece, keep quiet leaders, but your role is to facilitate an effective conversation. So what are you going to tolerate in that conversation? Because you've got one who's like, well, I think it's this, and could kill the whole conversation. So there's a skill in facilitating that, but I think it's essential. Yes. Yeah,
absolutely. And Ron, totally agree with your comment there. High performance usually means there will be some conflict somewhere, sometime, as the team is pushing the envelope. 100%, right? Absolutely agree. Which brings me to my final question, and one I know I did ask you beforehand, and you went, oh, that's interesting. And is, can you have a high performing team? Can you call your team high performing if you're not meeting your objectives?
Yes.
Okay, good talk. And that's it, folks. No.
Sorry. Yes, of course you can. And well, I think I said this to you when we noodled it before, is that where do those outcomes and those objectives come from, and are they realistic? Like, the conditions are the conditions. We still don't have a playbook for what's going on out there, not completely.
No.
And I think we have to be careful. I was dead certain, yes, and I am. I would stand by that.
Yeah.
But I think that piece is that team is high performing when if we're working on a stretch goal and this is new to us, and we're still playing, experimenting with how we're going to do that, we might not reach those outcomes whilst we're learning.
Right.
Because those outcomes were set probably arbitrarily from someone down there who doesn't even know.
Yeah.
But we're making gains. We're having those, high, what do we say there? Intellectual friction is high and social friction is low. So we're having those intellectual friction conversations where we really we're getting behind this and we're beginning to get it right. And we're still moving. Yes, you're still high performing. You might not be reaching those targets. And that's one of the problems with stretch goals. You might not get to there, but you may be here instead of there. I'd say you were still winning in that pace.
Yeah, no, and I agree, right? Because so much over the past 2 years, almost 2 years now, is uncharted. But if I look at this from the perspective of, if your team is still learning and adapting and trying to move the ball forward, you can still have a high performing team. The arbitrary objective, in some cases, if objectives aren't met, just based on financials and the realistic nature of where a business may be at, you may be a high performing team that isn't around because that's where the company is going or what the circumstances are, but that still doesn't mean you weren't high performing as you were trying to achieve that objective. Mm-hmm. So, but here we are, 8:44. Ooh. And my thought is, let's share with folks as we can get them on with their Friday. One big idea, a couple strategies and some questions to consider.
Let's get there. Here we are. One big idea. And we've mentioned this already. What is the worst behavior that you're tolerating? This could be a conversation all in itself as to how we deal with this. We didn't lean into those, what do you do with that person on your team too much, but I think this is the big piece is, culture isn't something that you can put on your wall on a poster. Culture is what you do every day. And people say you can't put your finger on it. Absolutely, you can. So 2 things that we can take away from here. Craig, this one talks a little bit actually to where we started the conversation today. How do you have that culture conversation? So here are 4 bullet points. As a team, absolutely map your current culture in words. And it's really important that everybody's perspective is in there because they will be different. And that's something to celebrate as well, the fact that we do see it differently. And as a leader, fascinating piece to really dig into is how different members of your team are seeing that. And then what are the gaps between what we think and say we'll do and what we physically actually do? And then as we start to look at those gaps, what behaviors would address the ones where you want to close that gap between the two? And then actually, I don't think we've ever talked about this, but these sprints are quite popular at the moment. But start small. What will we do for the next month? How will we know if we've been successful? What will we do if we've not been successful? And then reevaluate, look at it again. Do we want to do this for longer? Is this now a habit? And it all is just keeping that cadence of communication running. I wish I'd remembered that when you asked me that question at the beginning of the day.
Okay, it's there now.
There we go. The second one too, I like this. And I think somebody put in the chat, one size doesn't fit all. No, it doesn't. Know your people. So what's your team's washing instructions? And this is becoming something that's sticking now. For the longest time, we've said, treat others as you would like to be treated. No, no, no. Please treat them how they would like to be treated. And you don't know the answer to this if you don't know your people.
Yeah.
So social capital, make the time for conversation, find that piece to hang out. And then there'll be no surprise to my 3 questions for this week as you leave. Contemplate this. What is the worst behavior that you are tolerating? And then really, to me, culture comes down to choices. People make choices, and those choices lead to our culture. So take a moment, contemplate the choices that you're making today, and then what will the ones be that you'll make tomorrow or Monday if you're keeping this work related.
There you go.
There you are.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Another great conversation. We've got 3 more left before the end of the year. We'll be back next Thursday. We're going to chat about ESG. So a bit of a different conversation. I'm looking forward to that one with our partners from the Envision Group. Emotional intelligence next Friday, looking at imposter syndrome. And then finally, December 3rd, before we break for the year, talking about DEI or EDI, inclusive leadership. So if you've got any questions, want to reach out, have any further conversations about what you've heard today or in previous conversations, don't hesitate. And other than that, have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see everybody soon. Take care.
Sounds good. Enjoy. Thank you, Craig.
You bet. Bye-bye.